Today we're going to answer the age-old question. Is Ripple dumping XRP on you? What's going on, everybody? It's your boy Crypto Bobby. I hope you are having a great day, great night, wherever you are watching or listening in from, and welcome to another episode, another edition of the YouTube podcast here. And today I want to dive into a little bit more about Ripple's quarterly market update, which is an interesting thing every quarter to look at, and this quarter was actually no exception. If not, probably one of the most interesting ones yet, in my personal opinion. And we'll get into the reasons why. But if you haven't seen it, I will put a link in the YouTube description and the podcast description as well. But so Ripple releases their Ripple Insights every quarter. And for Q2 of 2019, they just dropped theirs yesterday. It's an 11-minute read. You probably don't need that much time on it at all. But the big thing with Ripple this quarter, as well as in Q1 of this year, is they sold a lot of XRP. And they do that primarily through two different ways: institutional direct sales, or what they classify as institutional direct sales, or programmatic sales. Those are the two ways in which that Ripple sells XRP. And in Q1 of 2019, they sold close to 170 million, $169.5 million worth of XRP. And in Q2 of 2019, they sold $251 million worth of XRP. Why is that interesting, you might ask? As for me, somebody who does not hold XRP, and for you, maybe somebody who does hold XRP, maybe somebody who doesn't hold XRP. Well, the reason I think it's interesting is because if we pop over to OnchainFX, and I think OnchainFX is great for this for a number of reasons. But if we look at the top 10 of crypto assets in 2019, we'll take a look at the year-to-date performance against USD. Bitcoin is up 166% against USD in 2019. Ethereum is up 63% against USD in 2019. XRP is down 10% against USD. Like, okay, let's just... maybe XRP is just having maybe other ones are down a little bit too. Well, no, let's take a quick look more. Litecoin is up 200%. Bitcoin Cash is up 89%. EOS is up 76%. Binance, BNB, is up 395%. And Stellar is down 22%. And Bitcoin Satoshi's Vision, Craig Wright's little baby, is up 85%. And then even Cardano is up 46% against USD. So what do the two cryptocurrencies have in common when you look at what are the two cryptocurrencies that are down over the course of 2019 have in common when you look at why they're down? Well, one of the things, and again, shout out to OnchainFX for having this information, but one of the things that is pretty interesting when you check it out is you can see the current inflation of both. And this is something that will probably be a little bit contested by the XRP community or the Ripple community as a whole. But with Messari, they consider the sale of XRP on a quarterly basis as inflation or an inflationary mechanism, which I would tend to agree with as well. And when you calculate that in, the annual inflation of XRP is about 25% on an annual basis. Every other crypto asset that is up, the inflation is actually, probably under 5% or so. Bitcoin's inflation is 3.4%. Ethereum's is 4.5%. Litecoin's is 4.3%, although the halving is coming up, so it's traded pretty hotly in advance of that. BNB is actually a deflationary cryptocurrency at this point in time because of the burns that they have. You could probably consider it deflationary. And then you have Stellar, which is the only other one in the top 10 that is down against USD year to date, and the inflation there is 39%. So looking at these two things, you can certainly see, at least in the high market cap crypto assets, a correlation, at least in 2019, between the inflation of an asset and the ability for that asset to increase in value. And obviously, there was a ridiculous thread on crypto Twitter that I still, for the life of me, can't figure out. I'm sure a lot of you folks have seen it. It was a few days ago, but it was an individual, it was a woman who was writing about the market capitalization of cryptocurrencies and how that is a construct of fake volume and a bunch of just ridiculous things, and then try to kind of conflate supply and demand to things in a totally convoluted argument that fully applied the Billy Madison, you are now all dumber for having heard that, fully went to that. But when you do look at all of this stuff now, I do, especially with the larger cap assets, if there is something where you have a significant amount of sell pressure on that asset, especially as the market as a whole, let's say from a demand perspective, has cooled down a little bit, you definitely can. Something like XRP, it makes sense why it's down year to date against USD, because there simply isn't enough buy pressure to support the sells that are happening, in my mind, from Ripple itself. And you can certainly look too, if you go down the list, there are the one thing I do want to say before kind of hopping into the specifics of this, but if you go down the list on Masari, the one thing I look at is current inflation, and you can do so simply by clicking on the, kind of sorting and clicking on the side. There are assets that do have high inflation that have performed pretty well. So you might look at the chart on OnchainFX and you see, current inflation for something like Neo is high, or Tezos is 10%, or some of these other assets is up there in terms of inflation, and they've performed okay in 2019 against USD. Not that great against Bitcoin, but against USD. The one thing I would caution you when looking at inflation versus performance so far and thinking about this in the broader picture is some of these networks do offer incentives for certain work on the network, like when you're talking about baking on Tezos or something like LivePeer or some of these other like proof of stake type mechanisms where you can actively participate in certain activities and you can stake your asset to earn some type of yield to prevent yourself from being diluted. The one part about, I think, Ripple XRP that's kind of interesting in comparison to some of these other ones is there's nothing you can really do as a holder of XRP to prevent yourself from being quote unquote diluted or having the inflation, or having kind of the inflationary nature of things. So I do think that while it doesn't necessarily, I wouldn't necessarily look at the inflation column across the board and say, okay, inflation is X, and that means the asset is going to perform badly. I don't think that necessarily is a direct correlation. I think two things on that. Number one, you have to consider how the inflation is occurring and if there's anything that you can do on the network to prevent yourself from being diluted, such as in a proof of stake network where you can stake your coins to perform some type of work, delegate your coins, whatever it might be, to earn some type of reward that either lessens that inflation. So maybe the inflation is 15%, but you get a 12% annual yield from staking your assets. That's one thing to consider. The second thing to consider too is the large cap versus the small cap. Depending upon the amount of inflation in a large cap, you're obviously going to need that much more buy pressure to support the price. And we're at a point, at least in my mind, and at my kind of, in my opinion, in the crypto industry or in just kind of the crypto world right now, where there's not a ton of fresh money coming into altcoins. Let's say there's not a brand new rush of people running in buying altcoins. You don't have kids standing in front of their Ferraris in their garages with posters telling you to buy I don't know, XRP and Tron and Verge because they're going to be the next great thing in the world. That's not really happening right now. We're not at that stage of the market. So if something is a large cap crypto asset with a $7-8 billion liquid market cap, $10 billion liquid market cap, and it is basically providing $250 million of sell pressure on the market on a quarterly basis, there needs to be that buy demand for that, and we're not necessarily seeing that. On a smaller cap side, you might see something with a very large inflation rate, but perhaps the price is done okay. Part of that, though, is because for small cap crypto assets, the markets are so illiquid that even a little bit of buy pressure on the upward side could really change things. So I would caution you to differentiate between large cap and small cap there too. But overall, when we're looking at this, and what am I thinking about this? So number one, I do think it's important to think about the inflationary constructs of crypto assets. When you're looking at potential halvings, when is that happening? What does that mean? People talk about, obviously, Litecoin a lot because that's coming up in the near future. I'm not a big Litecoin guy, but people talk about Litecoin as the halving is coming up. Bitcoin, the halving is obviously coming up in 2020. That could be a huge supply shock, and in a positive way from a price standpoint. This, however, is the complete opposite. You are having a company. You have Ripple, which is basically funding its operations by selling XRP both to institutional counterparties and directly onto the market through programmatic sales. And the one thing I would say is, if you are an XRP fan, if you're big advocate for Ripple, does this actually advance your case? Does this help you, or is this the opposite? And in my mind, it's shocking to me. It's really shocking to me, to be honest, about how many people defend XRP in the process of these sales for that are clearly reducing the value, in my mind, of the asset, and putting really downward pressure on the price of the asset, clearly doing that. And I do think that is something that you want to consider. Granted, in the Q2 highlights, they do say that they are looking to substantially reduce the future sales of XRP. So now that we're thinking about that, this is all in hindsight. So this is a Q2 report for 2019. This is in hindsight. But let's say, and I'm not buying XRP whatsoever. I have no interest in it. But let's say Ripple comes out and sells $50 million worth of XRP instead of $250 million of XRP on the to institutional direct sales and to programmatic clients in Q3 of 2019. If that were to be the case, and we see a direct correlation there in Q4, we look back, we see the report, you can start putting kind of two and two together, and you might be able to look at this guidance too and go back to it and say, hey, maybe now is actually a buy opportunity if you're purely speculating. I do think that the fact that they do say they're substantially reducing the future sales does give me maybe some thoughts about, not necessarily that I would buy or trade this, but does give me some thoughts that, hey, maybe if this is that substantially influenced by the sale of XRP onto the open market, if they do, I don't know what substantially is that $50 million? Is that getting it back to Q1 to $179 or $170 million? Or is that below $100 million? What is the natural buy pressure for XRP that will allow it to actually increase in value again? Something, if you are an XRP fan, that I would definitely be keeping an eye on and thinking about in the long run of things. But outside of that, I hope just from a supply and demand and thoughts on where Ripple and what they're doing with XRP in terms of selling it on the market and how it's affected the price of XRP, as you could see down 10% over the course of the year, as everything else is basically up in the green, multiple double digits, and XRP is one of the few ones down. Hopefully that just kind of gives you a little bit of thought. And I would recommend OnchainFX is one of my favorite tools. I would recommend, if you ever are interested, go to Messari.com/ or go to Messari.io/OnchainFX and play around with the sorting functionalities and the tools. There's so many different things you can kind of mess around with that I think kind of provide some insight to things maybe you didn't think about, and you can perhaps draw some correlation there between things and maybe help yourself out a little bit in the long run. Outside of that, if you did enjoy this video, make sure to subscribe and hit the thumbs up button. You're listening on the podcast as well. Appreciate you, and make sure to subscribe and leave a rating and review. Crypto Bobby signing out. Hope you have a good one. Peace.